World of Warfare presents
Operation Typhoon, the battle that broke the Blitzkrieg. While many historians point to the Nazis' defeat at Stalingrad as the real turning point moment in Hitler's eventual downfall in World War II Europe, many others point to the Battle for Moscow as the real moment that broke the Nazis' reliance on their Blitzkrieg or lightning offensive strategy. For when they took aim at the heart of communism, an ideology that Hitler and the Third Reich had sworn to annihilate, their unbounded confidence in Aryan superiority bucked up against a bitterly defiant Soviet people. Aided by a few muddy, frozen weeks that sealed Hitler's fate, it's Moscow, not Stalingrad, that proved to be the real death knell for the Third Reich, because history isn't always told by those who win, but by those who survive. Drunk from their Blitzkrieg sweeps through Poland, the Low Countries of the Netherlands, Belgium and Luxembourg, and the fall of France, Hitler's overreach into the Soviet Union was not just about Lebensraum or living space for his growing Aryan race, but a war of eradication against Soviet communism, against the Slavic people, and ultimately the Jews. Believing that the Soviet Union was a giant with flat feet, Hitler decided to move forward with Operation Barbarossa, largely on intelligence reports submitted during the 1930s, when Stalin purged many of his top military leaders, leaving the giant nation, in Hitler's mind anyway, unprepared for war. He also believed that communism had all but shattered Soviet morale, leaving the country ripe for a quick and easy invasion. Before the invasion began, Soviet leader Joseph Stalin refused to believe that Germany would renege on the Molotov-Ribbentrop Soviet-German Non-Aggression Pact of 1939, believing that he would at least receive some kind of preemptive offer of peace from Hitler before any military aggression would take place. In what historians now brand as a fool's errand, Stalin received some 90 warnings of an impending invasion, opting to dismiss all of them as unrealistic, given the Nazis' commitment of men and resources in the Western Front. In Hitler's mind, however, he never intended to keep the peace with Russia, since he believed that communism was a Jewish conspiracy and that the Slavic people were racially inferior. He also believed that the Soviet military had been hollowed out and compromised by Stalin's purges of the 1930s, leaving both the country and its military at a critical point of collapse. Once Adolf Hitler had made his decision to invade Russia, thereby enlarging his footprint of aggression into a two-front war, the German assault on Russia was by every measure an astounding success, at least until Hitler's advance stalled in the grips of a Russian winter. Named after Holy Roman Emperor Frederick Barbarossa, known as Redbeard, who had embarked on a religious crusade to the east centuries earlier, Operation Barbarossa stands as the largest invasion in world military history, and perhaps the single most important reason why Hitler and the Nazis lost World War II. Commencing with Blitzkrieg precision on June 22nd of 1941, Barbarossa would see 3 million Wehrmacht fighters push into Russia, more than 75% of the German army at the time, employing 600,000 vehicles and an equal number of horses, including 3,500 tanks and 2,700 aircraft. Much like Barbarossa's crusade in 1188, Hitler envisioned his own crusade under Operation Barbarossa, this time one of racial purity, conquest of new lands, and the final destruction of communism. Planning began in earnest in late 1940 as the Luftwaffe continued to press on Great Britain. Hitler ordered his Directive No. 21 on December 18th, ordering that preparations begin for an invasion of the Soviet Union no later than May the 15th of 1941, whereby the Wehrmacht was to crush the Red Army in a Blitzkrieg campaign lasting no more than 3 to 4 months. Across a front that eventually grew to more than 1,800 miles, 151 German divisions would advance into the Soviet Union, along with 40 divisions from Axis partners, including Slovakia, Romania, Finland, Italy, Hungary, and Spain. First would come extensive bombing raids as far as Leningrad and Sevastopol in the Crimea, while intensive German artillery fire would soften Russian positions across the entirety of the front. 3 German groups would prove to be the heavyweights of the attack force: Group North under the command of Field Marshal Wilhelm Ritter von Lieb, Army Group Center under Field Marshal Feder von Bock, and Army Group South under the command of Field Marshal Gerd von Rundstedt, which, in the face of total Soviet unpreparedness, would push 50 miles into Soviet territory within the first 24 hours of the attack. Army Group Center, plus half the committed German armor, would drive on Minsk and Moscow, while Army Group South would focus on the Ukraine, which was the centerpiece of Hitler's Lebensraum promised to the German people. On June 22nd, German panzer groups poured into Russia, quickly overrunning poorly organized Soviet border defenses, while destroying nearly half of the entire Soviet air fleet on the ground before pilots could get airborne. General Heitz Guderian's 2nd Panzer Army led the charge out of Army Group Center's front at Bryansk, before splitting into 2 groups, one headed south, the other to the north, with the intention of encircling Soviet troops of the 3rd and 10th Armies to form the Bialystok and Minsk pockets. 290,000 Soviet troops surrendered on June the 30th, handing over 2,500 tanks and 1,500 guns. In the first week alone, the Nazis inflicted nearly 600,000 Soviet casualties, leading war observers around the world to estimate that the Soviet Union would fall to the Nazis within 6 weeks' time. Meanwhile, the 1st Panzer Army and the 11th Army, both from Army Group South, surged in tandem across Ukraine's Bug River to form the Uman Pocket, surrendering an additional 100,000 Soviet men. Kyiv would fall next on September 19th, losing 600,000 more Soviet men, 2,500 tanks, and 1,000 guns, before Guderian's panzer group rejoined Army Group Center for their relentless drive on Moscow. By the time winter descended on Russia in December, the Soviets had lost almost 2 million soldiers, while their armored vehicles and much of their air fleet had been destroyed, yet at great cost to the Germans as well, who suffered 400,000 casualties and 40% of their armor during the battles of Minsk and Smolensk alone. Despite Russia's early disarray and costly defeats, a fierce determination engulfed the Soviet people, whose immense population allowed the Red Army to launch their own war of attrition, appointing Marshal Georgy Zhukov as the Red Army's commander-in-chief, just as winter joined the battle, effectively squashing the Germans' hope of a short war and even victory itself. Stunned by the invasion, Stalin disappeared from public view for nearly 2 weeks, reportedly hiding out in his dacha with full expectations that he would soon be overthrown. Finally re-emerging on July the 3rd, Stalin addressed the Soviet people on public radio, calling for a great patriotic war to defend the motherland, leading the Soviet people to respond to Stalin's challenge despite the catastrophe unfolding along the Eastern Front. Partisan units formed behind enemy lines, while massive recruitment and conscription efforts ramped into high gear. Entire factories evacuated to the Ural Mountains to escape the Germans' onslaught, where they slowly rebuilt the Red Army's weapons of war amidst an intense spirit of patriotic resistance. Resistance, however, came at a terrible price, since as German forces advanced, they did so with Einsatzgruppen Mobile SS killing squads, whose purpose was to follow the German army across Europe and now Russia, executing Jews, communists, homosexuals, and ethnic undesirables in the Nazis' ideological war of extermination. Over the course of the war, no more than 3,000 men were employed in the Einsatzgruppen, and yet they murdered nearly 2 million people between them, which constitutes the first major killing stage of Hitler's final solution,
nicknamed by some historians as the Holocaust by bullets. Most Einsatzgruppen officers had earned postgraduate degrees from universities, where a part of their job was to reassure ordinary German troops that the mass murders that went on before their eyes and at their own hands was scientifically and morally justified. After a time, however, the scale of the killings began to affect the men of the Einsatzgruppen and the troops they oversaw, for despite reassurances by Einsatzgruppen officers that what they were doing was scientifically and morally good, troops began to crack under the weight of so many executions. Murder-weary soldiers soon turned to alcohol abuse to dampen their depression. Many committed suicide before Holocaust mastermind Heinrich Himmler decided that a new form of mass murder was in order, something much more efficient, clinical, and mechanized, leading Himmler to order the construction of Belzec concentration camp on October 13th of 1941, the first of several purpose-built extermination camps. He then decreed that the Jews of Eastern Europe should be loaded onto trains and sent to death camps, before doing the same to the Jews of Western Europe.
In the first 30 days since the invasion began, Field Marshal Ritter von Leeb, commander of Army Group North, pushed within 135 miles of Leningrad, while the Nazis' Finnish allies moved independently towards the same destination. Field Marshal Peter von Bock's Army Group Center pushed a remarkable 480 miles into Russia, capturing many key cities including Smolensk on July 17th, considered an important geographic gateway to the capture of Moscow. At the same time, Army Group South under Field Marshal Gerd von Rundstedt tore through the Ukraine.
To the north, Army Group North moved at lightning speed through the Baltic states of Lithuania, Latvia, and Estonia, in Riga, pushing forward toward Leningrad, the birthplace of the Bolshevik Revolution, despite rising Soviet resistance, reaching the outskirts of the city by late August. Instead of storming Leningrad in a potential high-casualty situation for Wehrmacht forces, Hitler ordered the siege of Leningrad, meant to starve the city into submission. In one of the longest and most brutal sieges in recorded world history, the siege of Leningrad would go on for 872 days at a cost of 1 million lives. As winter approached, von Bock's Army Group Center encircled hundreds of thousands of Soviet troops at Smolensk, opening the door for an attack on Moscow and the Kremlin. The Soviets at Smolensk held out until August 9th before surrendering an additional 310,000 Soviet troops. Fearing that his flanking army groups would be exposed, however, Hitler diverted von Bock's force southward to assist in the Ukraine, a delay that would prove to be catastrophic when Army Group Center returned to Moscow in October under Operation Typhoon. During Army Group Center's diversion to the Ukraine, the Soviets had strengthened their defenses around Moscow, injecting thousands of fresh conscripts into the ranks of the city's defenders. When the Germans reached the outskirts of Moscow by late November, however, the harsh Russian winter would take a devastating toll, a force of nature that even Hitler had not accounted for. Meanwhile, in the Ukraine, Army Group South faced the toughest terrain and strongest Soviet resistance around such cities as Kyiv, Kharkov, and Odessa. Yet by late September, the Germans captured both Kyiv and over 600,000 Soviet troops in one of the largest encirclements in world military history. Many Ukrainians saw the Nazi invaders as a savior from Stalin's brutal rule. However, their hopes were quickly shattered by the Nazis' brutal racial policies, leading to mass executions, deportation, and famine. The conquest of Ukraine also handed the Nazis a treasure trove of desperately needed natural resources, such as grain, coal, and oil fields to the east.
When the Germans launched their assault on Moscow on September 30th, 1941, codenamed Operation Typhoon, Stalin had a force of 800,000 soldiers in defense of the city. However, of the 83 divisions around Moscow, only 25 were fully operational. Slowed by the Soviets' elaborate defensive lines, Army Group Center captured a series of small to medium cities on its path toward Moscow, while the 2nd Panzer Group took Oryol, 75 miles south of the Soviets' first main defensive line. 3 days later, Bryansk fell to the Germans, encircling the Soviet 3rd and 13th Armies. To the north, the 3rd and 4th Panzer Armies attacked Vyazma and Moscow's first defensive line, trapping 4 Soviet armies before taking 663,000 additional Soviet prisoners, now in excess of 3 million men since the start of Barbarossa. With less than 90,000 men and 150 tanks left to defend Moscow, by October 13th, the 3rd Panzer Group was less than 87 miles from Moscow, prompting Stalin to declare martial law over the now panicked Muscovite population of some 200 million lives. Providence favored the Russians, however, when heavy rains and snow turned roadways into mud, forcing the Germans to call a halt on October 31st after narrow-track German tanks clogged roadways headed toward Moscow. While the halt gave the Germans time to restore their precarious supply line situation, the halt again favored Stalin, who had time to organize 11 new armies, including 30 divisions of Siberian troops who were better able to cope with brutal winter conditions. The pause also helped Soviet industry come through with 1,000 new tanks, but when temperatures fell precipitously, thereby freezing muddy roadways, the Germans resumed their push for Moscow on November 15th, with plans to move the 3rd and 4th Panzer Armies across the Moscow-Volga Canal to attack the city from the northeast, while the 2nd Panzer Group would attack Tula before closing in on Moscow from the south. Both moves were intended to draw the bulk of the Soviets' armies away from central Moscow in response to the threats to the city's north and south, thereby allowing the German 4th Army to attack the city center. The Nazis' plan, however, collapsed under shortages of fuel and ammunition, allowing the Soviets to turn back the 2nd Panzer Group to the south, while on November 22nd, Stalin's new Siberian units launched a counterattack that virtually annihilated the German 2nd Panzer Group, while the 4th Panzer Group successfully pushed the Soviets back across the Moscow-Volga Canal. With the 7th Panzer Division just 22 miles from Red Square to the south, to the northwest, the Nazis reached present-day Lobna, just 18 miles from the Kremlin, leading some German officers to claim that they could see the golden domes and spires of Red Square through their binoculars. By late October, German forces were badly worn down, with less than a third of their motorized vehicles still in working order, while infantry divisions still faced serious supply issues and improper winter clothing, even though most divisions had been reduced to half strength. Standing down from October 31st to November 15th before launching a second offensive on Moscow, Germany's high command believed that the Soviets were incapable of launching a second defense of the city, given their egregious number of casualties, an assumption that would ultimately lead to the Nazis' defeat. Germany's push for Moscow resumed on November 15th in the face of heavy Soviet resistance and temperatures as low as -49 degrees Fahrenheit. And while the 7th Panzer Division seized a bridgehead over the Moscow-Volga Canal on November 27th, the Germans were pushed back on December 5th when the Soviets launched an all-out counteroffensive. As German soldiers froze to death due to insufficient clothing, most German weapons and vehicles ceased functioning in the bitterly cold conditions, forcing gunnery crews to remove frozen grease from each shell they wanted to fire. Under the weight of the Soviets' counteroffensive, the Axis offensive on Moscow at last halted for good, leading Panzer General Heinz Guderian to write in his journal that the offensive on Moscow failed. "We underestimated the enemy's strength, as well as his size and climate. Fortunately, I stopped my troops on 5 December, otherwise the catastrophe would be unavoidable." On December 8th, Hitler signed his Directive Number 39, ordering his Wehrmacht forces to assume a defensive stance across the whole of the Eastern Front, effectively ending his goals for Operation Typhoon. During the Battle of Moscow alone, the Germans saw 581,000 soldiers killed, captured, missing, or wounded, while the Soviets suffered 1,029,234 casualties, roughly a fourth of all Soviet casualties during the entirety of Operation Barbarossa, turning the tide on Hitler's expansionist ambitions into one of steadily failing defense of the German homeland.